Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog Series. It's Sunday, October 5th, 2025, and on Sundays we talk about the purpose and meaning of life. And welcome to week 40 of the Dr. J Vlog Series. So putting out a new vlog every day, and this is our 40th week. And so now I think I'm going to get quite serious. If you followed along thus far, remember if you want to encourage others to join, that'd be great. But I'm going to take this up a notch. What am I talking about? Well, this week we're going to be talking about tribes and cultural reproduction. But I'm going to sort of start this off by talking about the old nature-nurture debate, which used to rage in terms of human inheritance and behavior. And to be honest, I used to be firmly on the nature side, or the cultural determinism side of that debate, up until about a couple of decades ago. And then some major things happened in life that deeply influenced my thinking, not the least of which was my brother's heart attack back in 2007, which I've discussed previously. But long story short, I was inspired to open up the black box once again to examine the possible influences on human beings, and I arrived at what I think can be the only logical conclusion based on the scientific evidence. That is to say that genes and culture are both incredibly important, are vital to our very existence and survival. And maybe that's always been obvious, but it has a deeper implication for me. Certainly, by recognizing the complementarity of genes and culture, this allows for us a new way to think about the human condition, and by extension, the purpose and meaning of life. So first, on the genetic side, we are unavoidably biological creatures, and we contain a remarkably similar genetic allotment that makes us all incredibly similar to one another, at least as Homo sapiens. Sure, we look different in terms of our skin color and facial features and our heights and our weights and our genders and so on, but there's obviously, we're only really talking there about our external appearances. But at our core and on the internal and at the genetic side, we are 99.9+% identical to one another. So that allows for just a tiny bit of variation that accounts for our differences in physical appearances and to some degree susceptibility to diseases and a few other things. But to me, the fact remains that almost anyone, at least in principle, can mate with basically just about anyone else, provided you've got all the adequate biological tools and functioning capacities in place. And so that fact alone never ceases to amaze me. And yet herein lies a fascinating dilemma as well. For what's the prime directive of genetics everywhere, including among human beings? What's the purpose and meaning of genetic life, shall we say, as best we can determine? Well, from my understanding, it's to replicate itself. That is, to pass along the genetic inheritances and ensure their survival via reproduction. So our bodies then, at least, again, thinking in terms of human beings, are the carriers of our genetic complements. And that's why we're supposed to be passing these along. Although more and more people these days are choosing not to have children, not to engage in that process. And so that's kind of the dilemma I just alluded to a moment ago. In other words, the desire not to reproduce means that we are allowing for the death of at least our specific individual level gene pools. So what's the big deal? And that's not altogether uncommon in nature, quite frankly. In other words, there are members of many other species who don't reproduce either, as in the helper animals or the service insects, or if they're in environments that direct against reproduction by threatening their own lives due to scarcity of resources, or simply because of a lack of adequate partners. Okay, but yet beyond our genetics, we've also then developed another complementary means to pass along information. And that is, of course, our minds, which have been the basis of transmitting vast amounts of information quite apart from what's contained in our DNAs. To be clear, we inherited the genetic aspects of our brain, but at the same time, and that of course comes from our biological relatives, but exactly what's being managed in these operating systems that depends quite obviously on and reflects our cultural exposure. So yes, we're all the products then of genetic instructions and the information that's encoded in our genes that we inherit, but we inherit much more than our genetics. We inherit the language and the living circumstances of our parents or caregivers and how we think and what we believe, and mostly from our cultures or from our tribes. So our tribes are, in the words of Mark Pagel, our cultural survival vehicles. The counterpart to our bodies is our genetic survival vehicles. But unlike our genetic complement, human beings have created and reproduced far more diverse cultural survival vehicles. So in other words, we differ much more profoundly from one another culturally than we do genetically, in my view. Yes, there are some cultural universals, but our cultural lives are so diverse at times as to be perhaps even unrecognizable between tribes. We can, in effect, live in entirely separate cultural worlds where we would have to work incredibly hard just to be able to communicate and understand one another. And so, as Pagel writes in his book, Wired for Culture, our tribes as our cultural survival vehicles complement our physical bodies. And I'm going to quote him now directly. Like our physical bodies, this cultural body wraps us in a protective layer, not of muscles and skin, but of knowledge and technologies. And it gives us our language, cooperation, and shared identity, end quote. Again, these are all things that we all know. This is kind of sociology 101 in my view. But there's an interesting implication too. If we ask the question, what's the purpose and meaning of life from a tribal perspective, just as we've asked it about biological life? And so that would be, in effect, to pass along our tribal information, our cultures from one generation to the next. And I'm not saying this from an essentialist point of view or with the belief that somehow we are programmed or destined to do this and pass along our culture in a causal sense. Rather, I'm just stressing the importance that tribes basically everywhere have attached to their own survival, and the many belief systems and justificatory mechanisms that we've created to emphasize the vital tasks of our tribes and societies surviving. And so that's why the greatest threat to people, that is after or beyond material threats to their survival in terms of their environments, the greatest threat is the loss of language. For once a language dies out, it becomes much harder then to pass along the knowledge and the identities of the tribe or that which previously existed. And yet, few of us then can imagine then really living without our cultures and certainly our languages. Or we can't imagine then a world in which our very tribes might be destroyed. In fact, who among us does not oppose genocide or the complete destruction or annihilation of a given people? Well, actually, a lot of people. And so therein lies the other dilemma, if you will. How many or what percentage? I don't know. I don't have the figures. But just as our genes can be interpreted as being selfish at times and privileging their own survival over those of others, perhaps, so too our tribes can be selfish in privileging their survival over others. And here's the kicker. We do this on the basis of creating stories and myths and ideologies to justify why our tribe is unique, special, based on one or more, typically, of the following indicators or sources. That is language and ethno-racial distinctions, religions, and these days, nations. As far as we can tell, our genetic complements don't ever question their very own existence or come up with justifications for why they plan how they're going to plan to shape our physical selves and proclivities, and why other genes are less deserving. But with culture, we sort of do this all the time. And therein lies the greatest conceit of the human condition, that somehow our culture, in the broadest sense of that term, has passed along that which reminds us that we are particularly special and deserving, and others not so much. And sure, we can often adopt more of a live and let live perspective, to be sure, and that can help mitigate some of the problems that we might have. And some people do adopt a much more of a live and let live perspective. But even then, most people have these quite distinct tribal influences and biases and identities. Not everyone. My experience, though, most people do cling quite tenaciously to their own tribal and cultural biases, often to the exclusion or to the detriment of other people, the outsiders, the non-tribal members, if you will. Most people can't imagine living without or beyond a tribe. That's how the whole modern world is organized, quite frankly. The tribal system writ large in terms of societies and, the international system of nations and so on. And so, and yet that's where I've arrived at perhaps my most radically different sort of judgment and conclusion. That is the possibility of living in and of nature and beyond our tribal selves. And there's a lot to unpack there. I guess what I'm saying in the simplest term, just to get this kicked off for this week, and I'm just going to end in a moment, is that just as we're not obligated to reproduce genetically, we are not obligated to reproduce culturally either. But if that's the case, what are the implications in terms of the purpose and meaning of life? And again, that's what I want to continue to explore then through different angles for the rest of the week with the Dr. J vlog series. And I can well imagine that I'm going to lose some of you along the way, or that you might have some very good reasons to strongly disagree with what I'm going to be saying. That's fair enough. But if interested, I'm just going to ask you to hear me out, and at least before you draw your own, perhaps very different conclusions. Okay, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs and abundance. Hopefully, we'll see you tomorrow and continue on with this discussion from a more statistical and mathematical standpoint. See you then.